Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the fourth lecture of the lecture series, Religious Landscape of Pre-Islamic Arabia, analysis based on primary, epigraphic, and contemporary sources. Today we are going to discuss the Christianity. I will discuss what the situation will be, but beforehand, first I have to say I'm very happy to find one more time the opportunity to be with dear brothers and sisters, Ahlul Bayt Islamic Society of New England and Zikr Shia Muslim Association. And I want to also congratulate the occasions we have in front of us, the 15th of Shaban, the anniversary of the birth of the Imam Mahdi. So I congratulate you, and I hope you all consider me and my family in your prayers. So I will start it as usually we did these lectures with these verses as a blessing. If you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they will surely say Allah, say all praise belongs to Allah, but most of them do not know. To Allah belongs whatever is the heavens and the earth. Indeed, Allah is all sufficient and the all laudable. Uh, I'm not going to discuss whatever the goal of the lecture series is. We have kind of discussed it, but I will go again back to the map. This is the big rectangle, which includes Arabia. You know, we get all these regions: South Arabia, Hijaz, Yamam, Tahama, and then we can consider Sinai Peninsula, and then Levant, and then part of the Iraq. You know, and then to west of Euphrates, essentially, and then even to up here somehow. This we can call it Arabia. Although this part, what is called Jazeera, is in some sense is Arabia too. So maybe that also should be included. But this is the rectangle we discussed. And then we said regarding the sources, the emphasis was on the primary sources and then to be dated or datable material evidence, which is primary and contemporary. And then for most of discussion regarding Arabia, this will be inscriptions. When we said inscriptions are also two type, monumental, which are ordered from before, graffiti, which is mostly done spontaneously. Also contemporary literary evidence, which is divided into primary and secondary sources. Regarding Arabia's, one of Quran is also can be considered as contemporary sources, source, and pre-Islamic Arabic poetry. We have kind of discussed that the first lecture. The secondary sources are many non-Arabic texts, mostly in Syriac, Greek, and written by scholars living in Near East. And there are many non-contemporary literary evidence. Every topic, there is a vast pool of texts in Arabic, Persian, Greek, Syriac, other languages. And although some contain eyewitness narrations, but so in that sense, should consider primary because the span of time between the time of events and recording, most left Western scholarship consider secondary. We try to see a little bit the taste of what if we go to the secondary. So the primary sources, last lecture we discussed Judaism, Yemen, and Medina, especially Medina. Graffiti or inscriptions doesn't give us much information, but what it gives is nearly certain. But then you go to these other literary sources, secondary sources, they're vast part of information, but sometimes contradictory, sometimes dubious, sometimes it needs a lot of work. Actually, if work is coming out, some of it agree with those primary sources. And then I said something which I think maybe for this next lecture also be more important. First, we saw somewhere in the third century AD, or maybe second, but mostly third century, a rise of monotheism in all these kingdoms. Sassanid Empire established with its somehow militant Zoroastrianism, and the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. First Constantinople converted, then Christianity was accepted, then Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire, and then the only accepted or tolerated religion. So Roman Empire becomes a Christian empire. Then we have in Ethiopia simultaneously parallel the Ethiopian Aksum Empire was converted to Christianity, and then we had the Himyar Kingdom in Yemen, which is converted to Judaism, and we discussed it all last lecture. But the other thing which I think would be important, but maybe more next lecture, is these three Arab kingdoms, which where one is Sassanid kingdom, which nowadays they prefer to call them Japhnites, the family ruling it, but most Muslim and Arab historians they have been called it Ghassanids. Now Western scholarship, I think in the last 20 years, they start to call them Japhnites. They have, I would discuss it. They have a so-called Monophysite or Miaphysite branch of Christianity. They were, uh, their kingdom, we know, was here, somewhere here. And then they were ally of Rome or vassal of Roman Empire. The culture was Syriac. We have the Lakhmid kingdom, which again nowadays they call them by their family, ruling family Nasrids, or and then they were also Christian, but and then vassal of Persian Empire. So they were near the Hera and then near present day Kufa. So the capital was here. They were vassal of Sassanid Empire, but their culture also was Semitic Syriac. And then we have Kingdom of Kenda, which is Hujrids. They are we partially mentioned them last time, but they are mostly here. It was Kenda Empire in the south, a little bit closer to Yemen. Now, for today, I think I'm showing some of these with another map, which is a little bit more detailed because it's good to know these three main branches of Christianity. And then, as I said, so this is the Japhnid kingdom is more here, Nasrid kingdom is here. This is Sassanid Empire, Byzantine Empire. Byzantine Empire controlled Egypt and this area too, and so on. And then, if we will see, there are three main branch of Christianity, which differences was theological, also cultural. This is the imperial Christianity. So maybe let's look at here the imperial and Melkite or Chalcedonian or Diophysite Christianity, which I think we call them Chalcedonian Church, mostly Khalq maybe in Arabic and Farsi. They were Greek speaking. They were promoted officially by the Byzantine Empire. They were spread different places, mostly okay inside the Anatolia and some parts here. They're done, but they were because it's supported by the Byzantine Empire. Usually, they were the official church. But then we got a second church, which sometimes called Jacobite or Monophysite or Miaphysite, Yagubi, and which is primarily prevalent in the Levant, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, and its branch in Egypt, also called Coptic Church, which still we have them. So, and the differences was usually in the nature of Jesus. And so you see they are dominant here, all these areas. And then we have a Syriac-speaking East Nestorian Church, which is unique. Culturally is closer to the second church, Monophysite, the Jacobite, and they're not Greek, they're Semitic. The language and liturgy is Syriac. But they are more prevalent here, and then maybe Khuzestan in Iran. And then one other feature is that they are under jurisdiction and support of the Sassanid Empire. So kind of uh, this is unique. They're officially somehow connected or controlled or guided, or at least in the sense under influence of the Sassanid Empire. They're called Nestorians. And then they have some theological differences. So some aspect theologically, the third group is closer to the first one, but in many other aspects, the second and third are closer together. And there was a strong rivalry. For example, in Islamic one, we have the different Sunnis and then different branch of Shias, for example, Ismailis, Imamis, Zaydis, and then uh, different Sunnis sometimes branch along the fiqh schools, Maliki, Hanbali, Shafi'i, and so on. But this is important. This is a very important political and social dynamic of the pre-Islamic time. Now, this lecture, I kind of see what it goes. I kind of prefer to go deeper in Christianity. Maybe we do the three lectures on Christianity, and then, inshallah, anytime we find we can go to the Mushrikeen or Gentile religion. The topic which is important, I think is important for the Quran, is we had it for the Judaism too. So what was the development of Judaism generally after the sack of Jerusalem and the destruction of temple um, to the time of the appearance of Islam. And then we went one by one to the regions of inscriptions, Northern Arabia and Southern Arabia. Here for the Christianity, the discussion about what was happening, what was going on, is as some aspects important for understanding Quranic verses what you do. Although we don't do that using this knowledge we acquired going to the Quranic verses and so on. But it's a background. I think helps maybe people going through that. And then okay, then regarding Christianity, Arabia, we can go with three regions. Actually, contrary to Judaism, which or opposite to Judaism, which the southern part, Yemen, has more rich story about Judaism. Christianity is present in southern. We know about it. We discussed it, the story of Abraha too. But that maybe next lecture we do it briefly. And then the other two regions are important and rich and maybe less well known. Okay, one important thing we can start is maybe this is a perspective of Western scholarship. I'm not putting it, uh, I don't 100% agree with it, putting it this way, but look, to state the problem, when you look to the Quran, Quran has a strong emphasis in monotheism and then some law and purity and dietary law, which in many aspects seems closer to Judaism. Very similarities is there. And then, avoidance of blood, eating pork and carrion would have been in line with most late antique Jews would have espoused. But then, so some people have claimed Quran or Islam closer to Judaism. But then from the other side, also those who argue this way, they say, yeah, the break with Christianity is bigger, at least the message of Quran. For example, first Quran is drastically have different view with in the Christology of Quran is different what is Christians believed or not believe. And also there is an assumption that Christianity uh, is law free. And then overall, they said, okay, if we go to the time of Prophet Muhammad, and then if a Christian and Jews would listen to the message of Prophet Muhammad, the Jews will feel more closeness and affinity, and then Christians feel the message more alien or different than their own traditional belief. There are, okay, some concluded, so they maybe Christians may be less inclined to be joining the movement or the community of Prophet Muhammad, but we know this is kind of reverse, or at least the relationship, both from Quranic perspective and the Christians are more amicable. And then we go large groups of Christians converted to Islam, which we want to see which group they were and what they were. And then part of this assumption is that Christianity was a religion without law, without regulation, which we see nowadays. We don't see much discussion about purity laws. We don't see much discussion about dietary laws. We don't see much discussion even ritual worship. You don't see in Protestant churches, for example, at doing some kind of prayers, pilgrimage, just okay, theology, prayer, and then reading the good book and doing good works, stuff like that. Even good works in some part of Protestantism is grace that save you, not the good work. So that is you can if we look to what is a Christianity is, we see this contrast more. But the whole idea today at the early part is that it wasn't like that at the pre-Islamic time, early Islamic time, and especially in the region of Near East and the region which under Syriac culture, Semitic culture. And then this is a big debate in Christian studies, Jewish studies, Western academia, and in the last maybe 20 years, 30 years. Okay, they now emphasize is that maybe Jesus was foremost Jewish. And then so the kind of we can say the first generation Christians were not Christians in the sense were Jewish and following Jewish culture, Jewish custom. And then they did not need necessarily see Christianity a break from Judaism. That's kind of we want to a little bit emphasize. I mean, it seems, looking to the Jesus, even Paul, they all followed the injunction, prescriptions of Torah, following halakha, following the law as it was said. And then the idea that Jesus have rejected or would have rejected, this is the non-Western scholarship thing, Torah or declare all food cleans. At least some of the authors, Paula Fredrickson, she's very famous in this kind of stuff. There are other ones. They claim this is a fantasy, a Markian fantasy. I mean, Gospel of Mark. Uh, this you have to go to a little detail of Gospels. Gospel of Mark is mostly written for the Gentiles, toward the Gentiles, to non the Jews. So over there you see uh, more emphasize the breaking with the past tradition of Judaism is seen. But as we can see some sentences of Jesus which are famous, and I'm going to show, no, it couldn't be this the case, really. And that's important to understand what really uh, Injil was, what is the mission of Jesus was, in what sense, what he was doing, even for us. But it seems during time of Jesus, he was preaching to the Jews, not to taking them out of the Judaism. You can see, for example, is not somebody can preach and take you from one religion to the other one. The other one want to preach you, okay, be a better Muslim or better be inside Islam, for example, become Shia or be better Shia or for example, join this Sufi group and so on. The fact whether Jesus, in the time of Jesus, the mission to the Gentiles is not very clear, but we know definitely he had missions because they send apostles in groups of two, 70 of them different places. It seems the verses of Surah Yasin is referring to that they sent two messenger and the third one coming helping them. Most commentators now think this is about those kind of missions by the apostles or Havariyun of Jesus. But whether the mission was outside Palestine or even inside Palestine, Greek cities, going to the non-Gentile is not clear. But we know some Gentiles, non-Jews, were converted to Judaism. Look, I have to say that this lecture, and this is a lot in Judaism, and then you will see this also kind of infected Christianity too, that a distinction between a Jew and non-Jew, and then you will hear it a lot. In Islam, this distinction is not there. We don't have a Muslim and not, in that sense, everybody become Muslim will be the same. And then we don't have any chosen people in Islam, and we don't have any priesthood, which Christianity has. So everybody become Muslim, they are the same. There's no ethnicity before is important. We see Judaism and Christianity, this is there. And then also there is no some intermediate between human beings, God. Everybody's his own priest. So everybody is chosen, everybody is priest. So this have in mind. But this has some important consequences, this dichotomy, this two groupness of Jews and non-Jews in the laws, not only for Judaism, for the Christianity. So this is the background of the early part discussion today. Uh, the uh, so I think there were converts. We have at least we accept in the New Testament. There are some Roman soldiers convert, but there was no attempt to converting them. It seems after that this starts, and Paul was one of the zealous messenger to them. But these are all detailed discussion, which we don't need to go to mind. The thing maybe started with the Paul is this. Paul make a distinction, but later on it seems, at least according to the book of Acts, James, brother of Jesus and the leader of the church, really accepting it, is that okay, what about if the non-Jews want to convert? So what we should require with them? They start to interpret, and this has roots early in Judaism because there were non-Jews living with the Jews, sometimes non-ethnically Jews. So what we are talking about is the lineage, descendant of Abraham. This ethnicity is always here. And then they said, okay, for those people which are non-ethnically Jew or want to live among Jews, They don't need to follow all the halakha or sharia, but they have to follow some rules. The minimal was they call Noahid law, some basic, don't steal, don't kill, don't fornicate, and stuff like that. And this was there in the Jewish tradition. And then here Paul kind of goes that way. Uh, he doesn't say that he himself is not going to abide by necessarily by the Jewish law because I've become Christian. Paul has an important role to spend in Christianity is Paulinity, especially Christianity. In some sense, maybe the role of the second caliph in Islam. Um, you know, but then he says, okay, if you're non-Jew converting to Christianity, you don't need to do all those regulation. For example, you don't need to be circumcised, or you don't need to follow everything, just some basic one. Here we see two sets of law, two sets of requirement will be developed. One for those who are ethnically Jews, descendant of Abraham, now they want to become Christian. So they still follow at least at some aspect of it, the the injunctions of the Torah for the Jews, but the non-Jews, they do not need to do that. There is some roots of it. I mean, there is a long discussion. I'm not going to go through that. Essentially, when the two religion breaks from each other, the two complete separate identity coming out. Uh, some people thought very early the Christianity separate from Judaism. Then the discussion go through that. No, this doesn't seem because the early Christians, especially those living in Jerusalem, like the leadership of James, they consider themselves Jewish. Ethnically, they're Jewish. They're following the Sharia injunctions of Torah. So they are not considering themselves a separate religion, different religion, just a more emphasized, a more stricter one. And actually, the message of Jesus in many aspects can be looked like that. But then there are some scholars still, this breaks has happened. Some people, and especially by this topic scientifically by some of the writings of J.D.G. Down, which is called Parting of the Ways, discuss when this Christianity separated from Judaism. The same way you want to see when the Sunnism or Shiism form. And then actually, in some sense, Shiism first formed in Islam, Shia Islam, and then Sunnism is in a reaction or after format, and then how they get their shape or so on is a little bit later on. But generally they say, okay, after the first rebellion, and we discussed it 2 lectures ago, and destruction of the temple, and the second rebellion by the Jews, somehow Roman exiled them. When the temple destroyed, they couldn't do the shrine visiting and sacrifices. The priesthood of temple dismantled, and then after our second uprising, Jews were much dispersed around outside the Palestine. So it was a big change as a Judaism and led into the formation of rabbinic Judaism. That is the time the Christians also separated themselves, become separate community. They don't go to their own, for example, previously the synagogue. Previously, maybe they attended the synagogues. Now they separated. They have their own churches and so on. Some people emphasize, okay, like Daniel Boyarin, that, okay, it wasn't as sharp as this, and we shouldn't completely separate them. The separation happened maybe later on, 150 years later. Some of the Quranic allusions can match these. Sometimes there is, and then you see sometimes there was not much distinction between Judaism and Christianity. But again, for per se, the Quranic references is not against we consider they really fully separated from each other. At least the time of Quran revelation, they were fully separated from each other. But these are debates. But at this, how much of it is important, how much is not? I'm like, when it's happened is not big deal. But I think the issue of law, which I want to now go through it, is important for this separation. And whether we had a spectrum, continuous spectrum, that one part of the Judaism, part of Christianity, and then maybe early stages Christians consider themselves as part of Judaism, like Ahmadiyya. People consider themselves part of Islam, but many Muslims do not accept it, while Baha'is do not consider themselves part of Islam, and then clearly have take a break. But that really the main topic will be law. So let's go to let's because that's I think is important for some understanding of the Quran. So as I said, because we are looking a little bit to development of these religions, but at least we can say by the fourth century, nobody had doubt that there are separate identities and separate religions, and people distinguish them. They themselves distinguish themselves. But look, the one I think is important is this misconception, as I said earlier, law-free religion of the Christianity is the religion without law. We know that Islam has Sharia, and Judaism has halakha, and very important for both of these religion. Law has some precedence to theology or belief. They're mostly about doing than believing. But Christianity is different. Is a theological religion that you mostly have to know or state or believe some sentences, and then the dogmas, developing dogma, memorizing them, stating them is important. While in Islam, the real principal pillars are practical. Shahada is a practical thing. You have to say Shahada when you convert, and then you have to do the ghusl, and then you have the prayers, you have fasting, you have Hajj, you have Zakat, and some other people add some other. Then you have Furu'id and stuff like that. But this issue of law is important because the reason is that in Quran you feel these Christians in Quran addressing are more law abiding. There have some law comparing with the Christians we see now. Um, and Quran and then Christianity today, and especially Western Christianity, the one which is Western and Roman Empire, you feel there is no law. There is nothing of these dietary regulations, purity laws, ghusl, all those things are gone. Uh, and and then if you try to judge the Christians at that time by the Christians you see now here, I think produce some confusion. But there is a famous sentence, and which kind of support our early statement that Jesus and early Christians did not want to break from Judaism and putting aside this Judaic law. This is a famous statement by Jesus that although present-day Christians want to reinterpret it, but I think it's very hard to interpret what's the appearance of the text. Jesus said, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill." So he doesn't say I'm going to not do it, but what I say is to understand it, to do it better, to not stick to the letter, but sticking to the spirit of it, following the spirit of it. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter, a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. So I'm not going to take it away. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. So he condemns those. I mean, we have this tendency in Sufism too, in Sufi Islam. Oh, okay, you're Sufi, you reach to God, you don't need to follow Sharia. So this called Abahagari, or many some trends of Sufism or have in Islam, especially manifesting this attitude. Okay, because we are in a spiritual path, we don't need to follow the laws of Sharia. So, but here you see he condemned them, Jesus, and but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So this is his sentence, emphasizing on it, very explicit, part of a big sermon of the Mount, very influential. So, because this is the biggest difference or contrast, as I said, between Quran and Islam and Christianity we see, besides the Christology, which, but this is at least in social level, even in living with the Christians, because for example, in Quran you feel you can eat their food. They're Ahl Kitab. Quran doesn't say go, you can eat the food of the Jews. But you don't see any Christians following any dietary law, I mean, nowadays. So can we go, for example, get the fish of the, we can't, we don't. Most of us don't. I mean, other people have fatwa that the kosher Jewish food, which is kosher, is acceptable by Muslims to eat. But the the Christian ones, I don't see any. I mean, except fish, but that also we have to be sure they haven't taken it out by explosion. So you see, but you feel language of Quran is not like that. You feel the Christians there are observing some part of this dietary law. So that's the topic, is essentially emphasizing a little bit. Okay. So rather than erasing the law, Jesus is depicted as upholding it and indeed arguing for more rigorous observance of it. Um, and then we can say Gospel of Matthew was written for the Jews and by the Jews. Uh, Definitely understand what he's saying, and then it's hard to reinterpret it something besides what he's saying. At least if is a debate with the Christians. And then this interpretation of law and Jesus, that Jesus is not going to abolish the law, contrary to what we saw, and is practicing it, was held by a good number of the Christians, early Christians, to late antiquity. Maybe they were not majority, but they were not that small. Although it seems those who become church fathers and then maybe the leader in the Paul movement, which become dominant later on, uh, negate this. But uh, it was there. And then we can see here a contrast, and I think that's the point. The contrast between Greek and Latin and more Western, Byzantine, Eastern Roman, and Western Roman churches, and the Eastern Syriac ones. In the Greek and Latin tradition, we see interpretations coming and become dominant that the new covenant uh, with Jesus came, we have the new covenant at the Jadid. And then Paul says, now you don't need to obey the old covenant, Ahd Atiq. And old covenant usually was understood, following these laws of Torah. And then, so suggesting with the coming of Christ, the fulfillment and resignment of the law had already occurred. So this is now, you see the dominant view. You go to the churches, or Catholic or Protestant churches, talk with them. They say no. The whole thing is that we don't need to follow that law. But we see in the Syriac tradition, more Eastern churches, that Miaphysite and Nestorian ones, or the places where Semitic Syriac culture was dominant, uh, they did not try to reinterpret this strong passage we read, which is support the law in such a way that kind of denying the law, but they understood the law positive sense. So actually, exactly this must be the reason the change happened, because many of these Christians converted to Islam, and then so they're not in existence. And I think uh, the Christian communities which are left later on in the Crusades or other one, maybe influenced by the Western ones, and the Western churches maybe drifted more, the one the Roman Empire and so on, to be contrast with Muslims and Jews. So, and especially by humanism and translation of the philosophy books, classical books, they moved toward that rationality, theology, all those stuff. So this contrast is seen more. So they drifted away more and more of the law. And then the more part of Christianity which follow the law, believe in the law, believe in Sharia, be absorbed in Islamic world. Um, and then still we see again the same way you in Gospels regarding the Christology, the nature of Jesus, you see contradictions, and between what is, you can find evidence against what is dominant now. You see again issue of the law. So the two important point of contention between Islam and Christianity is Quran and Christianity is this Christology and this issue of the law. And then you can see that this inside the text, you see a little bit contradictory messages. So, for example, we see in the book of Acts, which is the explaining the events just after the Jesus, what the first generation did. There is something called apostolic decree. Now they call it apostolic decree. And then we said something about Noahide law, which was in the Jewish books, but exactly it requires, at least to the new converts, non-Jewish converts, to avoid meat sacrificed to idols, carrion, blood, and avoid fornication. And then for centuries, uh, uh, the converts usually follow this. And okay, the Jewish converts were usually uh, convert a more stricter law. And then again, you see mm, this was the belief. At least some requirements should be there. But again, you see later on, before coming of Islam, some trends start to loosening this obedience to the apostolic decree. I mean, let's see what this apostolic decree is, because it's the first level inside the New Testament we see explicitly, because Jesus was talking general, and then you have to understand generally the halakha. But here is a little bit more specific, and this is required for Gentiles. But again, you see this dichotomy between Jew and Gentile, we see. And then what is stated in this Acts 15:19 to 21 is essentially what we find in the Leviticus, Sefer Lavian. And then, but this is said from the word of James. Therefore, I, James, have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols, and from fornication, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood. For in every city for generation past Moses had those who proclaim him, for has been read aloud every Sabbath in the synagogues. So it says this law, this regulations was read in the cities which Jews were dominant. Always read in Sabbaths, and for the non-Jews these were required. And then look, this part is very similar to Quran. One thing you have to know: the Quranic dietary law. What is the Quran is very limited. Exactly is this. Polluted by idols means something given or dedicated or sacrificed for idols, which Quran is referring to. It is what is the name of a sacrifice it for someone besides God. The name of non-God, some entity, idol besides God is mentioned for his sacrifice, so that we cannot eat. Uh, strangled here is the word Jewish halakha used for animal that was dead, you know, uh, which is not killed in the uh, right way of sacrifice, or not killed in the hunting. And then blood is which we know is forbidden. And pig we will see. Swine is somewhere there, and I think that they wouldn't eat it in the whole Near East wasn't a problem. And then here fornication was added, so is this is not dietary law. Then we'll see the Quranic list also is minimal. We have to be careful. Three times Quran mentions in Surah Baqarah, Surah I think and then this is the topic, but everything Quran list is minimal. But we have Surah Ma'idah, I think is there too. But we have more, so that's a little question. How is but that's something else. Uh, and then one interesting thing is this: besides this apostolic degree, which has come in the Bible, we have some evidence that there were some group, Gentile Christians, non-Jewish one, followed a set of dietary regulations. And they're avoiding meat sacrifice to idols, carrion, blood, fornication. Um, and then this was the practice at least to the fourth century. At least the non-Jews were following a minimal, which is very much the minimum of the Quran. There are two sets of books or writings. One is called Didascalia and Pseudo-Clementine homilies that they show evidence of it, because some of it was like recording some lectures, Friday prayers, and then you see the advices the imams, Friday prayer imam is giving in the homilies. So it tells you what is the concern is, what is asked from the community. And Didascalia also was a manual for like Resale for a community of devoted Christians. So you see they have much more, especially that the Didascalia is interesting. You have much more. You will see besides the dietary law, purity laws, like we have wuzu, ghusl, other stuff. Uh, yeah, many things you see it is there. I mean, this takes a long discussion itself. Uh, I'm not going to go through that, but again, you see, uh, the homilies again distinguish between Jews and non-Jews, and then said Jews should still observe Mosaic law, and then this is a late text. So the Jews have become Christian. I mean, we're not talking Jews, which are ethnically Jewish. So you have to know Jewish, we understood here ethnically, not religion. Jews have become Christian. They're descendant of Abraham, or they're from those 12 tribes. They should follow the Mosaic law, even become Christians. This is go to 4th, 5th century, and then some of these books are late. So it means there were groups following as a Christian, following the law, maybe later. And then, but this homilies distinguish between those ethnically Jews and Gentile Christians. And then Gentile Christians, as I said, again, limited set of dietary but purity regulations. So there are some regulations. And they should follow 10 commandments, at least, and then apostolic degree and some other one. And didaskalia, which is more elaborate and worth also a discussion, this does not distinguish between Jews and Gentiles, which is not in the Quran. Actually, this whole Gersdaletin thinks didaskalia is very closer to Quran. I mean, many aspects is closer to, especially fiqh or law regulation Quran. And then it mentions the law is like a yoke, maybe a little bit negative, but some limiting thing on both the Jews and Christian church, and it doesn't distinguish between Jews and Gentiles. Uh, and then one interesting feature, because look, what we have a big difference with the Christians and partially Jews too regarding our dietary law is wine drinking. In Islam is completely forbidden, but in Christianity is not. Sometimes especially Catholics, they have it part of the ceremony of Eucharist, and then the Jews also have it. But we see, intriguingly or interestingly, the Pseudo-Clementine homilies and the Didaskalia both mention avoidance of moderation drinking wine. So there is something in that direction. A Christian is skeptical about or skewing wine might sound unexpected, but there is some evidence that there was a similar wariness toward wine among even the earliest Jesus group as well, since the wine might have been sacrificed to false deities as libation before serving. Okay, this goes that line, but the discussion is longer. Is not that the wine may be given to deities and that should it be ate. That is too should it be drank, but there are other factors in it too. And then overall, they say wine is uh, the thing instigate or push people to do violating the law. It says those who drink wine, then they're more carried to go drinking, doing other stuff, and then uh, now this dietary regulation is important. So per se is important, maybe more important than uh, because we want to see how were they close, how they were off this Christianity of before stuff. Holger Zelensky argued with good evidence that the Gentile dietary and purity regulation were upheld in much of early Christianity, and the classification of Christ believers into those of Jewish and Gentile background function in most forms of Christianity. So Christians were two types: ethnically Jews, like Sadat. We have a little bit different regulation regarding homes for Sadat and Sadaqah. So they have two groups of Christian: ethnically Jewish, non-ethnically Jewish. Ethnically Jewish, maybe they have to follow the halakha because God was required descendant of Abraham. So they are more strict. And then they become Christian, but they do that way. But the non-ethnic Jews, they become Christian, but still have to uphold much more dietary and purity regulations than what we see. So we can conclude this, and it appears in some or maybe many late antique Near Eastern Christians, especially in East, skewed idol meat, carrion, blood, and perhaps more rarely wine. And this dietary regulation with the addition of pork to the list of illicit food is exactly what we find in the Quran. The bulk we find in the Quran is this, really. Quran is four, you cannot eat one is the name of something besides God is taken on them, and that is dedicated to idols. Quran said very euphemistically, very indirectly. You cannot eat blood, drink blood. You cannot uh, eat some Jewish halakha got strangled. But we see at the beginning of Surah Al-Ma'idah, we have many, many technical words is used. But generally, the animals which is dead, we cannot eat except hunted. And also the swine is illicit. And so at least diet and wine. So the main is that. I know we have more a little bit, but it's not mentioned explicitly in the Quran. So you see, this closeness is interesting. There are also some evidences. Then these are evidences are secondary. Then you cannot go because some of these evidences we mentioned, these books are contemporary, primary. At least there are some other ones. Then you have to be careful if because other Western scholars have, regarding to Islam, the evidence should be very strict. All primary inscriptions, no secondary. But then here, some are loosened, but these are interesting. There are some heresy in those books writing with the different sects of Christianity, like books of Melal al-Nahal or Faraq, which we have in Islamic too. They mention some smaller Christian branches, which they consider non-Orthodox, like Ebionites, Nazarenes, Elkasites, and Simachians, which they were called Jewish Christian. So this idea that they were branded Jewish Christian because they would see in them much Jewishness than the typical Christians. They kept some of their Jewishness, maybe sticking to some of these laws, and uh, and then at least it's claimed they were following some dietary and purity laws, and then we are not discussing whether they distinguish between Gentiles and Jews, but it seems not as much. But they were generally, when you convert, uh, they follow. Actually, this is a belief that true Christianity, which is a follower of James and brothers of Jesus, family of Jesus, must have been like that. That attitude is that Jesus really was not changing much the law, but interpreting it and giving the moral dimension to it. But anyway, these are good records. And then one evidence which for me was interesting, and I always think it must be the case, that some of these groups have been survived to Islam and after that. Because the whole question was that those other Christian groups that maybe they have different Christology and also stick to the law, and what we can call them Jewish Christianity, which have the monotheism close to Islam, following the Sharia, did they survive the time of Islam or not? My understanding was that they had, and then they have been converted to Islam. And now, at least I was looking, it says that John of Damascus, which actually we have talked about him before. His father was working for the Umayyad court, Muawiyah, and then some caliphs after him. And he himself had gone to the court, maybe even see Yazid. They claim Yazid was older man when he was going to the court. He was maybe a child, 10 years old. Yazid was a man near caliphate, 30 years old. But this John Damascus then later on would become famous Christian scholar. But in his book concerning heresy, mentions that one of these sects, Elkasites, still occupying a part of Arabia near Dead Sea, which is in Palestine. So Jordan. So they continued. There were some groups of Christians, which heresigraphers assigned to them following in Sharia and different Christology. But always heresiographers are question mark because they're outsiders. They do not have usually good view of, for example, if you write about Ismailis, so on, outsider, usually have a negative, at least maybe it's not the best presentation, but still, they say something which can be considered negative, and then we can see it's true. So this is one part. Uh, The other thing we can add, even it seems, although maybe the majority of Christians, especially the West and Byzantine and Roman Empire, did not much follow specific dietary or purity regulations, the near Christian communities consider Christianity as a law. So we see some other texts. Look, now you ask Christians, do you have law? They say, no, we don't have law. We have abolished. They say we follow morality So fornication or lying or those stuff is that, but we don't have, uh, they distinguish between morality and fiqh, and that's coming to our culture in modern times too, and then which wasn't any distinction before, and then now if you ask them, no, we don't have any laws of like Jews, but okay, we have morality and so on. But Eastern Church, no. If you ask them, it seems no. Oh, we have Christians have laws and we follow that. And then one example of it is a book which is left. You see, the problem we don't have much resources left, but there is a book left called Syro-Roman Law Book, and this is interesting. Is not a book about a dietary law or purity laws, or is a book about mostly inheritance, which again you see in Islamic Quran is part of the Sharia. And then for the Western mind, this is a secular thing. It's not a religious thing. How you get inheritance is not related to religious ritual or so on. The same way they eating food now is not for them any religious, which it is us for us and the Jews. Uh, and this book uh, consider this as a Christian law, and consider this even state this law, which is about inheritance, and all these people consider this quote unquote secular law, is coming from Christ. Kind of the same view we have our inheritance laws that were on mentioned from God. So what I want to emphasize that there in near late antique Near Eastern Christian groups follow the law either in Jewish or Gentile form. That distinction was there. And then law observance was not merely a question of, uh, you know, uh, social organization, but salvation. That what we mean is not that people said, okay, yeah, they need to have a law because any community has a law, but it wasn't religious law. You cannot have a community without regulation, so they have their law. But what we would say, this inheritance law or other laws wasn't just a community make a regulation, organizing for themselves. They considered necessary for the salvation, so it had a religious dimension in it. So that's we want to add that when we go back to commentary Quran, these points should be kept in mind when analyzing Quranic passages that do with the Christians or people of the book, the law, and so on. And then as this one, I think Holger Zelentin says, and I partially agree, Quranic dietary and purity laws show striking overlap with apostolic decree, didascalia, and pseudo-Clementine homilies. They are close. But then again, much of our it is there, we said, is much later than early Christianity, comes to 400s. But again, we have the same problem for inscriptions that we didn't see, for example, much Jewish inscription or some monotheistic after 400, all these things sometimes. Again, we don't have many evidence, primary evidence left, especially about Arabia, that people are following. These books which I mentioned are copied later. Yes, they're translated later, but the texts were supposed to be 400. So again, we kind of ending up with, if you're too skeptic, uh, we don't have much direct evidence. Uh, Again, these were followed after 1400, that period of 100, maybe 70 years, 200 years to the Islam came. Prophet Muhammad born 570, Islam 610. But the point is that this skepticism doesn't work much. As I said, there was one report that says there was a community still was there. And then, although this report doesn't say they follow this law, but the other historiographer says they were distinguished to following the Jewish law. And I think if the communities exist, they don't change their behavior. So again, there's too much skepticism. I don't think this one is healthy. So we can accept there were Christian communities, uh, but following the law and continue to existence. Maybe they were not the majority, but still there were. And I think the East were more dominant, more important, more influential, and so on. Okay, so yeah, we have this. The other thing is the Christological debates. The detail of it we don't want to go through, but it's important because much of the Quranic criticism on Trinity and so on must be directed toward these views, but these are much nuances. I don't want to go through that detail, but I want to say what is the general social context of this debate was, because some of it was serious and then have caused the societies to be engaged. So there is no triune Godhead in the Bible. Even the dogma of the incarnation is scarcely present in the New Testament books. So this is some criticism they have done. You can find it somewhere, somehow, very indirectly. But then, but as we said, various forms of Christological dogma was articulated by different groups, different authorities. So, and then this is very complex, especially from the second century and onward. Two person, even I don't mention the detail, one of them is important because of the movement he produced was big. In the following century, Valentinus first, 160 AD, and then Arius, which is very important, 336, are the theological put forward views on Jesus and God that were later deemed heretical. So this Arius we use, which is closer to Islam, at least to the one we have now, was a bishop of one of the cities. And then he was very influential. The movement became very big. And it seems Constantine also converted to his version, but now is considered heretical. And this is the biggest heresy we have in Christianity in ancient times, you know. So, and then I believe that the conversions of some region to Islam, uh, even in Spain, and then the eastern parts, is because many of them are Arius views. They were persecuted, and they were not whatever, they were persecuted. They're not accepted by official church, and then their views is closer to Islam. When the Islam came, kind of they seized the similarities, and that was more motivation to convert into Islam. So Arius deemed that Jesus Christ was created after God and hence lesser than God. He was first and foremost a human being. So you see, this can fit very easily with Islam, and he get lots of followers. But you know, these debates, we cannot go through that. But you know, besides even this one mainstream Christology type of thing, we have the Sufi styles or those mystical ones, Gnosticism, Docetism, and many other isms. So generally, we have to understand, to make it talking about a one Christian dogma on any matter in these early centuries very, very hard. There were very different views competing to each other and rivaling each other, and then and then there was not one view. Uh, Now, one other thing also we have to know, these are very difficult discussing. It is the language of the scholasticism, using the Greek philosophy and all those techniques of logic and definition. They have gone to minuties, which many of them are maybe not necessary. Uh, I mean, it's taking a long time, but it's not doesn't mean that all people following this stuff are know about it. As Jack Tanis himself is a Christian Arab, says, that a very good scholar, and his book is very good, says we have to understand the concept of simple believer. The great majority of Christians in the Middle East belong to what church leaders to refer as the simple. They were overwhelmingly agrarian, mostly illiterate, and likely had little understanding of theological complexities that split apart the Christian community in the region. So most people do not understand, do not care, but these debates were there. Doesn't mean the society was not split. We have this kind of debates too in our community. Sometimes Quran is created or not created, eternal or not eternal. And then although that was a fight Ma'mun chose, and is mostly with the clerical establishment to establish his authority over them, but you know, we have ramifications. And then we have Mu'tazila and Ash'ari. And then we have in Shia tradition later on, you know, for example, with Shaykhiyya, non-Shaykhiyya, and then and older times, Mukhatta, Mugassara, you know, those, especially on the nature of imams, the powers of imam, purity of the imams. We have some of these debate 100 years ago in the time of Mashruta, for example, Iran, constitution revolution in Iran, and you see This split them not only on religious views, sometimes politically. So those were, for example, Shaykhia more inclined to be for Mashruta, for constitutional movement, other groups, maybe other side. I mean, so the debates sometimes go so minute, but most people do not understand the detail, maybe don't care, or simply just follow. We have to know that. And also, you have to know, especially regarding Christology, which is very difficult, and even nowadays they cannot explain it clearly, and I always say it's a mystery. This does not necessarily mean the priests themselves always had a good knowledge of the doctrine or the scripture either. There are many pieces of evidence pointing toward some priests having been illiterate and uneducated. In a striking fact, one of the bishops, Al-Chalcedon, could not read or write. So, so it doesn't mean necessarily. So the bishop, which is a leader of the church in a city and big area, attending a Chalcedon meeting, we'll see that is the name of the religion of supported by Empire too, but it is a meeting in Chalcedon, and then he attended that meeting. He had part of the decision, which actually split the church, but he himself could not read or write. So we have this kind of situation is, and then after this, I don't go through that, but I want to see what the cultural thing is that every now and then they start to get a meeting. They got synods and councils calling all the clergy, all the bishops from all the Christian world, as far as before Roman Empire be split. I think 325 was the Roman Empire wasn't split, but then later on split. So the Western, the Western part, France, England, all those, Germany, Spain were separated, but they call all of them, they gather over there, they debate each other, and then they announce some statement of belief. And then, for example, so the idea of carefully worded Christian creeds agreed by synods and councils become popular in the 4th and 5th centuries, in part to counter ideas such as those promulgated by Arius. This Arius was very, very influential, and they really uh, they want to confront it. This is the biggest one. And then Jesus created any human. And then the most important of these church councils are Nicaea 325 and Chalcedon 451. Actually, in Nicaea 202 and 325 is the first time we get the complete list of the Bible books we have in Catholic Church or Protestant Church come through. The Ethiopic one has a bigger collection, but the list of the canonical books, which is accepted in the church, is here established. Previously, there were separate books, and some people believe them or not believe them or something like that. And then and this is this established. And then the other one, which is a big one, Chalcedon 451, which is split the church. And then these rivalries after that was prominent in a century or 150 years before the appearance of Islam. Uh, and then we should not envision these synods and councils as being a low place of unanimous consensus, but of debate and controversy. Moreover, after a period church council, there were many participants that left it disagreeing with the notions that were put forward and agreed by the majority. For example, this Chalcedonian was meeting to solve this nature of Christ, and whether the difference between Miaphysite and then imperial church, and then one taught one Christ has one nature, the other one is two nature, but the way they agreed at the end caused that Eastern Church be separated, the one which is joined to the Sassanid Empire, Nestorian one. The details, really, I don't think we can for now follow it, or we needed to do that. This is the one. For instance, the Chalcedonian creed of the two natures, human and divine of Christ, that Christ at the same time is human and divine, at the same time, both. You cannot say he's only divine. The Monophysite was there. And you cannot say he's only human, which, okay, they don't agree. Arius was going there, but they want to have both. But how is not very clear. Human and divine of Christ was not accepted by many Eastern churches who instead championed what is called Miaphysite dogma. And then to see, for example, this is a description that, after the meetings were chaotic. And the reason I want to say we're talking that 150 years before Islam, religious conflicts. For example, Europe, we have months of religious conflicts, which led to first Reformation, religious conflicts, and then Renaissance and secularization. And then you have the same, for example, I mean, to know the background that many of these religious tensions were present among Christians in the last 150 years before Islam. Immediately after the introduction of the Council of Chalcedon, riot and great tumult at once arose in the capital, Constantinople. So they met it, they reached finished it, then the riot happens. The people were in commotion, congregation were disturbed, male and female monasteries were in a commotion, and many dissensions appeared among the Christians. And then, attitudes were not the same, and many of the people getting tired, they could not distinguish between the differences. Sometimes they don't think about it, but it's not always the case. Sometimes they say, okay, what is the difference between, for example, Akhbari and Usuli? And for most people nowadays, yeah, I actually forgot about that. That's one of the biggest schism in the Safavid period. We had Akhbari, Usuli, and nowadays we have no Akhbaris coming. But for most people, they don't understand it. They don't see the difference. And then, for example, either they become a religious or completely religious. I don't want to see the distinction. I think some of these fetting up and tiredness was spreading at that time. And then that was also motivated to people convert to Islam. I mean, one interesting example attitude to dealing with this stuff was taken by Procopius, which is, we discussed him, is a famous Byzantine historian, because we have record about Abraham, a primary contemporary record regarding Abraham from him, and that makes it important. He was initially Palestinian, but then joined Greek Byzantine army, and then he was in expedition for them. He somehow knew something about Abraham. I forgot how he got his information from, but he wrote it 2-3 pages. I think for this story, Abraham, I read them. But then his Gothic wars, he mentions, which is interesting, I think, topic. I mean, it has a lesson for us too, because he was a wise man too. I will not even record the points of disagreement between Byzantium and Roman doctrine, So now between the two capitals of Roman empires, East and West, although West has collapsed, now is difference of opinion on theology. And he said, I will not record it. So I think it's crazy folly to inquire what the real nature of God is. So I think these discussions, for example, we have the nature of imams, whether they're pure, anyway, they're pure or something like that, or the abilities, the knowledge. Sometimes we stick on it, we don't come out of it. What the real nature of God is, humans cannot even understand human things fully, let alone what pertains to the nature of God. So I intend to keep safely quiet about such matters, simply so that existing beliefs shall not be discarded. It says if you start to too much talk about this stuff, that existing belief discarded. I can say nothing about God except that he's totally good and has everything within his power, which is exactly what we know, and knows everything. But let's each say what he thinks he knows about these, both priests and laymen. And then, interestingly, so some of the historians are sensitive, and as we do, okay, whether the other guy is from for example, Monophysite or Nestorian or Melkite or so on. And then interesting, one of the kings, which we have to see later on, the Sassanids, and converting to Christianity. Romans were happy they convert to Christianity. And if you want to become vassal of Rome and joining Roman army, either in the German, tribes and Vandals, or that Europe, or here in Middle East, you should become Christian. So, the Germanic tribes were pagan. They were not Christian. And so some of them in the border of the Roman Empire was recruited by the Romans. So they see the benefit joining Roman army. And then they get position on it, they get barriers, and then sometimes Roman bestowing them princeship, kingship, give them government, they become vassal. But the condition, they had to be Christian, at least nominally, what they should become Christian. We have the same in the East too. And then we see, for example, Al-Haris, one of the founder of this Sassanid Empire or kingdom, he become Christian. But the point was this: he doesn't become a Melkite Christian or Chalcedonian Christian, which the empire, Byzantine Empire, was supporting. But he became Monophysite, which empire didn't like it. It's like for some Sunni government, some guy becomes Shia, so on, vice versa. And then many of the Byzantine historians noted this and were not happy about him. Procopius, from the other side, doesn't mention it even, but so we see that's his attitude. But maybe I think he's minority. But the point is that from other side, he's not shy of criticizing, and Haris, which they have important role in some of the events. We know this Hassanids were ethnically close to Aus and Khazraj in Medina, and there was some relationship between them, familiar relationship. And some people from Medina, also Khazraj, who used to go to their courts and serving in the army, maybe joining in the Roman Empire army, goes doing service for them. Uh, I think I'll finish soon. It is one, all these said, um, all these different opinion, the nature of Jesus, and then there were different groups coming out, one nature, two nature, even we find some three natures. And then the other thing is the problem is not only the relationship of God and Jesus, the Holy Spirit one, which I think Quran sometimes is criticizing that, in some of the verses of Surah Ma'idah, or even indirectly when say you in verse 116 or 78 or 72 that kind of says Christians, are you worship, why are you kind of implicate they're worshiping Mary. It's kind of pointing to the logical absurdities of their views. But despite all differences, uh, and then they were trying to explaining this nature of Jesus. They all want to claim we are monotheists, and they want to be always emphasize uh, our God is one. So that has been, I think, the chic or the prestigious one, because again, we saw this in Yemen. Some Judaic monotheism was there. We saw it in Ethiopia. We don't see after 5th century any polytheistic inscriptions in Yemen and other places. While before that, we have zillions in those deserts in Syria and other stuff. So add to the various Christian ways of conceptualizing divine, it should be noted that one of the important developments in Christian epigraphic formula of the time is the rising emphasis on one God. So, and in many of these inscriptions, they refer to God, one God, emphasizing that. The Greek expression, some they use eisteos, and we saw that in one of those inscriptions last lecture, which was the context of the Jewish one, and they use that too. So, one God, Ahad, maybe we can call it somehow. The formula was especially common on tombstones and appears first in the late 3rd century. The phrase that, as I said, that rise of monotheism. The phrase attested on Greek and Coptic tombstones to the Middle Ages. They use this istos. Hence, despite the probable supposition that many of the commissioners and engravers of these inscriptions, as well the buried, might have held the dogma of triune Godhead important to them. So, they were thinking Trinitarian in some way or form, but still they felt important to underscore that God is one, not three. I mean, how that's a whole problem, but it's still, they didn't write God is three, or actually Quran criticized them. Don't say God is the third of the three. But that's another question. But especially the Miaphysite Christians, again, that group, which maybe, I'm not sure, maybe in Ethiopia, but definitely in Egypt, Palestine, and the whole Levant had become dominant, and it was Syriac, and it was, although consider Jesus more or less only divine. They make it one nature, so they get rid of the human dimension. The Miaphysite Christians underline the monotheism to a large degree. For example, John of Ephesus emphasized the Miaphysite creedal proclamation was the true God is one and there is no other God but He. If this is true, you see, it's very somehow reminded some of the Islamic formulation, although their view is, as I said, is making Jesus divine, but the true God is one, and there is no other God but He. Uh, some Allahu Ahad or somehow is that. and there is La ilaha illallah, something like this. We can read it, uh, and so it's close. And I think again, I believe these are the groups converted to Islam very fast and easy, and it still today is. Those Christians have some problem with Trinity are the one that most fastest, easiest convert to Islam. Any doubt came when it's hearing Islam, they cannot uh, have a very consistent, accepted, or there are some problems with this triune God, which is the same time God and divine, they really convert. And you talk many of them, they have that problem. Jews are not like that. Maybe there's some other concerns they have, or some other people. So, and then you see these are mostly the region are now Christians, but now Muslim. In any case, whichever Christology they may subscribe to, there was never much doubt among Christians that they were monotheists. They considered them monotheists, and Quran more or less accepted. Nowadays, although in Sunni tradition more sometimes called Christians mushrikeen, but really people of the book have been treated in some aspects monotheists. Uh, when considering the Quranic stringent emphasis on monotheism, it has to be borne in mind that this was something that Near Eastern Christians, or Jews for that matter, would have very much agreed with. So that is also, although apparently the Christology is different, but at the end, because they want to emphasize monotheism, and it's that descent view of Miaphysite, which is very dominant in these areas near Arabia, or in the northern Arabia, have moving closer to the Islamic view, both in the law side, which we said they emphasize more, they emphasize Allah, and then also in the belief. And I think these are explaining, or more explaining what the conversion has happened. I mean, thank you for patience, and I'll stop here, and then if any questions, maybe.